Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1811. We will continue the reading from 1806 with the article Wittgenstein on Thinking as a Process or an Activity by Francis Lynn. And we mentioned earlier that thinking is not images. And how thinking in images, shown by an example of combining images with action and thinking, and saying, for everything I do, I will going to have an image. So you condition yourself in the end to think a certain image in the same moment you do something. That example did it for me anyway, to clearly show that thinking, that images are not necessary for thinking, and not even a condition, but they can accompany thinking, which is a different take. And now we continue with attacking from the Wittgensteinian perspective, thinking as inner speech. Since thinking is not talking aloud, we may then conjecture that it is inner speech we conduct in the imagination. Indeed, Plato regards thinking as a kind of talking to oneself in foro interno, the soul conversing with itself. Hanfling writes, as Wittgenstein pointed out, internal dialogue being neither necessary nor sufficient for thinking, but he does not explain why Wittgenstein indeed writes about the unnecessity and insufficiency of internal dialogue for thinking. On the insufficiency, Wittgenstein says that one cannot say that thinking means speaking in one's imagination. This can also be done without thinking. As the pen example shows, one can say, yes, this pen is blunt. Oh well, it'll do, aloud without thinking. In the same way, one can say the sentence silently to himself without thinking. Conversely, one can think and have the thought expressed by the pen sentence without actually speaking it, either aloud or silently. Johnston says that the idea of thinking as inner speech suffers from the following problem. Inner speech seems dead by itself and seems to require thinking to give it life. He thinks that this problem is shown in the remark by Wittgenstein. Plato says that thinking is a conversation. If it really were a conversation, one could only report the words of the conversation and the external circumstances under which it was carried out, but not also the meaning that these words then had for the speaker. If someone said to himself or out loud, "I hope to see Anne soon," it would make no sense to ask, "And which person of that name did you mean then?" For all that he did say was these words. But Johnston does not explain what this passage means. Many of Wittgenstein's remarks are difficult to understand, so simply quoting them is not very helpful. I think that the above passage says this: words by themselves are merely dead signs, and they need thinking in order to have meaning. So if we only hear some words, then based on this alone, we shall not know the meanings. We must know the thinking behind the words in order to know the meanings. Now, if thinking were just speaking, then reporting someone's thought would be the same as reporting his words, and hearing someone's words would be the same as knowing his thought, as knowing the meanings of the words. So if we heard someone utter, "I hope to see Anne soon," we would know his thought and know what Anne meant, and it would thus make no sense to ask, "And which person of that name did you mean then?" But in reality, on hearing the sentence, we often do not know who Anne is. for there could be many persons who bear this name, and we often need to ask about it. This is a reductio ad absurdum, showing that inner speech or talking aloud cannot be identified with thinking. In the subsection, we again saw that Wittgenstein has two ways of showing that inner speech or audible speech, auditable speech, is not thinking. One way to show that it is unnecessary and insufficient to thinking, and the other way being to show that it by itself is dead. Two, four. Thinking is not an accompanying process. We may also be tempted to think that thinking is a process that accompanies other processes, for instance, speaking. This is the target of philosophical investigation 330. In section 2.2 above, we discussed part of PI 330. Now let us see it in full. Is thinking a kind of speaking? One would like to say it is what distinguishes speech with thought from talking without thinking. And so it seems to be an accompaniment of speech, a process which may accompany something else or can go on by itself. Say, yes, this pen is blunt. Oh well, it will do. For thinking it, first thinking it, then without thought, then just think the thought without the words. Well, while doing some writing, I might test the point of my pen, make a face, and then go on with a gesture of resignation. I might also act in such a way while taking various measurements that an onlooker would say, I had without words thought. If two magnitudes are equal to a third, they are equal to one another. But what constitutes thought here is not some process which has to accompany the words if they are not to be spoken without thought. As the first paragraph in this passage explains, one can speak with thought and can also speak without thinking. So we are tempted to think that thinking is an independent process accompanying speaking. If the process occurs when one speaks with thought, and otherwise one speaks without thinking. Now, what does the second paragraph say? As made clear in section 2.2 above, the pen example shows that one can think without speaking. More precisely, one can do certain things which show that he has thought. Yes, this pen is blunt. Oh well, it'll do, without actually speaking the sentence. The case of taking measurements illustrates the same point. One can do certain things which show that he has the thought. If two magnitudes are equal to a third, they are equal to one another without actually uttering these words. So the pen example and the measurement example illustrate how one can think without speaking. This much is now clear. Now we will come to the last sentence. But what constitutes thought here is not some process which has to accompany the words if they are not to be spoken without thought. How are we to understand it? Hacker's exegesis of this last sentence is this. The moral of it is that what here constitutes thinking, that the pen is blunt, but that it will do, is not something that needs to accompany the utterance. The pen is blunt. Oh well, it'll do, in order that the utterance not to be thoughtless. But this is no explanation, for it is merely a paraphrase of Wittgenstein's last sentence in PI 330. We are still unclear about what the last sentence in PI 330 means. Hanfling tries to explain the sentence in the following way. He refers to the three tasks Wittgenstein asks us to perform in the second paragraph in PI 330 and writes, "These are baffling instructions. What kind of action on my part would count as obeying them? Yet such instructions should be clear and straightforward if the accompaniment theory were correct." There are two problems with Hanfling's explanation. First, the three instructions, as I have explained in section 2.2 above, are not baffling. And it is clear what kind of action counts as obeying them. Second, why should such instructions be clear and straightforward if the accompaniment theory were correct? Suppose that thinking were a process accompanying the pen sentence. Yes, this pen is blunt. Oh, well, it'll do. The three instructions would be: first, say the sentence with thought. Second, say the sentence without thought. Third, just have the thought without speaking the sentence. To follow the first instruction, one would need to say the pen sentence and let the thinking process occur. To follow the second instruction, one would need to speak the sentence and not let the thinking process occur. To follow the third instruction, one would need not to speak, but just let the thinking process occur. But would it be clear and straightforward to follow these instructions? How would one let the thinking process occur or not occur in the first two cases? And in the first case, how would one let the thinking process occur, which is not just any process, but one that with content? Yes, this pen is blunt. Pretty excellent. Oh, well, it'll do. These are by no means clear and straightforward. So if Wittgenstein's instructions in PI 330 were baffling, then they would be so too if the accompaniment theory were correct. Hanfling's passage quoted above means to say that the accompaniment theory is wrong. But my analysis shows that his argument fails. This means that he has not identified the real fault with the accompaniment theory. In other words, he has not explained why thinking is not an accompanying process. So, how are we to understand the last sentence of PI 330? But what constitutes thought here is not some process which has to accompany the words if they are not spoken without thought. A sentence, which is a series of words, can be spoken without thought. So we are tempted to think that if a sentence is to be spoken with thought, or equivalently, not to be spoken without thought, then there must be a process, the thinking, accompanying the speaking of it. So we are inclined to think that the thought is constituted by the accompanying process. But the thought is not constituted by the accompanying process. The explanation for this is not provided in PI 330. Rather, is to be found in PI 332. While we sometimes call it thinking to accompany a sentence by a mental process, that accompaniment is not what we mean by a thought. Say a sentence and think it. Say it with understanding. And now you do not say it and just do what you accompanied it with when you said it with understanding. And here's an example. Sing this tune with expression. And now you don't sing it, but repeats its expression. And here one actually might repeat something. For example, motions of the body, slower and faster breathing, and so on. This remark is by no means easy to understand. So I shall here discuss it in some detail. Let us start with the first sentence. We do sometimes accompany a sentence by a mental process. As Heidegger explains, when we say, oh, it would be so nice, we may conjure up a series of images of snow falling, snow-covered fields, roaring log fires in the hearth, etc. Now, why does Wittgenstein say that we sometimes call the mental process accompanying a sentence thinking? And yet that thinking is not an accompanying mental process. Isn't there a contradiction here? I want now to make clear that no contradiction exists here. This point is very important. To help us understand it, I would like to refer to Wittgenstein's discussion of sudden understanding. I think we need to put a little stop here. It goes nicely into what we previously went through in 1810. And that thinking is actually a doing. And it gets even clearer now when we sort of compare the idea of asking oneself to accompany a doing with a thought. And then we realize it's a very strange additive. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Just as we showed, adding a picture to an action maybe can be trained, but it also shows that the picture, whereas as well as the word, does not need to accompany. They don't have a place more than just being there, or equally as well, not being there. See the world as doings, and what is real is a sort of doing. And we are of this doing world, we human beings. So to say that thinking is always the same for everyone, or even for a single person, that brings in the private language argument. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Thinking could be tried out as doing rather. Doing that is different from who does it, what is his skills. His thinking will be more advanced, deeper, more to the point, more rewarding, of course, more fantastic, more enjoyable, just because he expanded his life world with a more complex language game. No person's world is ever alike because of these factors. And going into Francis Link's wonderful article here, he makes it absolutely clear, without no doubt, that inner speech never, ever have to accompany doings or thinking or actions. or none of those complexities needs to be there. It's enough with just the doing, and it's not as simple as we think. Well, I say thank you very much. Have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.